I'm very, very happy to be here and to welcome you to the opening reception of our annual NYU Conference on International Relations and Technology. International Relations in the Age of Technology. I would like to start by expressing my profound gratitude to my dear and long-standing friend, philanthropist, artist, businesswoman, Charney. Charney made all of this possible by giving us the space and providing all the great food and the great atmosphere and the great staff. And Charney, as you will probably notice, is involved in many things. Here you have a list of the first 20 things on her agenda. But as far as I'm concerned, two things that she is involved with, I'm connected to. The first is the Israeli space mission. I don't know if you know that, but the Israeli aircraft, the spacecraft just crashed on the moon. Which was it got to the moon, not in one piece, but who cares? But the most interesting thing about Tzili's contribution to this great effort is that Tzili met a person who had this vision that many people thought was insane. He said, we are the first civilization in the history of mankind that has the ability to record every note ever created. Every word, every work of art, every song, every image. We have the capacity to create a civilizational backup disk. And then he said, okay, once we do that, we need to make sure that the disk will never be destroyed. So he created a disk the size of a nickel, made out of quartz, on which he uploaded all the information that this civilization ever created. And then he said, where can I put this disk so the disk will be safe? And he said, the moon. Who's going to the moon?
Alice.
The Israelis. All right, let me get in touch with the Israelis. I put him in touch with Space IL. And thanks to a generous contribution made by Charney, today we have everything up on the moon, including the archives of the Leon Charney Foundation and the great work that Leon Charney did on behalf of the Jewish people, advancing peace between Israelis and Egyptians back in the late 1970s under President Jimmy Carter. So that's the first thing that Tzili is doing that is connected to me. The second thing is, as you can see, we have a very impressive advisory board over there of the newly established Charney Forum on New Diplomacy. You may ask, what is New Diplomacy? New Diplomacy works under the assumption that diplomacy is not only in the hands of governments, it's not only G2G. There's a lot of place for businesses to get involved, a lot of place to people-to-people diplomacy. But the most important thing is diplomacy is no longer about nations. Diplomacy today is about cities. It's about culture. It's about science. It's about all those things. And we go back to basics, to what it really means to develop relations. This is really the story of diplomacy. So Tzili founded the Leon Charney Forum on New Diplomacy at the University of Haifa, and myself as faculty at NYU, I was asked to join as a chairman, and it is an honor and a privilege, and I thank you for that. So a big thank you, Tzili Charney. Tomorrow, we are going to have a day full of excitement with great speakers, but everything that we do is really for the next generation. I'd like to acknowledge several of the NYU Master's students that are in the room. Please raise your hand when I mention your name. Maria, Miranda, and Shai, three of my favorite students. And I also would like to acknowledge the presence of my former intern, who's now an executive with Snapchat, Sophia Gross. Please raise your hand. When you look at Sophia, you understand why it's so important to invest in the younger generation, and within less than 10 years, she really made it in a very big way. Some of the speakers are here tonight. I'd like to acknowledge them and tell you a little bit about them. First, I'd like to acknowledge the presence of my very dear friend Scott Shea, who will be the morning keynote. Where is Scott?
He had to go.
What?
He has to leave.
He had to leave, I'm sorry, but I wanted to tell you on behalf of Scott Shea. Scott Shea is the chairman of Signature Bank, which is an incredible bank on the cutting edge of technology. He's an author who wrote a book called In Good Faith. Why am I mentioning it to you? Because he promised that if you will stay throughout the whole day until the closing reception, every person that will attend the closing reception will get a free copy of his new book, In Good Faith. All right? So I just say that on behalf of Scott. We have here with us Oscar-nominated filmmaker Michel Ohioan. Where is Michel? Michel was nominated for her great documentary, Colors Straight Up, and since then she produced several other amazing documentaries. She's a very good friend of mine, and her entire family, in fact, and her boyfriend is a friend of mine, so she's part of the family. Michel came all the way from Los Angeles. Also from Los Angeles, a long-standing friend of the conference, Professor Nicholas Kahl, Nick Kahl, British-born, expert on public diplomacy with the Annenberg School. He's the director of the master's program. By the way, I just want you to know for the record, I tried to get in, they declined. So you're looking at a failure of the American, educational system. From Ottawa, Canada, we have Peter Jones, an expert on conflict resolution. Thank you for being here, Professor Jones. A fellow NYU professor, Dr. Efi Halamish, an expert on trade law, who will speak about US-China trade wars and new diplomacy. Another very, very dear friend of mine is here, Tomer Sharon, who probably influenced the lives of every person in the room more than anybody else here, because he, for many, many years, was in charge of user experience for Google. He became a guru in the field of user experience. Please raise your hand, I want people to know you. And Tomer Sharon, wrote a book, 2 books about user experience, and tomorrow he will address the 5 principles of user experience. After his successful stint with Google, he moved on to Goldman Sachs, because, yeah, we won't hold him against him. But it shows that Goldman Sachs, actually, they know what they're doing if they hire Tomer Sharon. Thank you. We have several other speakers that couldn't make it tonight, so we'll keep them for tomorrow. I would like to also acknowledge 2 other NYU faculty in the room, Dr. Lisa Sassoon, an expert on nutrition, who did a great project in Israel, and filmmaker Tzipi Tope, who's here, also a professor at NYU. And now it gives me great pleasure to introduce the keynote speaker for tonight, who is definitely one of my role models ever since I met her many, many years ago. I met Margery Kraus when I was in the early stages of developing the strategy for Israel as a brand, and I learned for the first time about this company based in Washington, D.C. called APCO Worldwide. And I didn't know much about the company, but I immediately was fascinated by her own personal story, which she will share with us tonight. But let me tell you, Margery Kraus did something that was viewed by many people impossible. All by herself, with no really organizational support, she was able to create a global company, which is considered to be one of the best companies in the world in its field. And I say that because I'm a member of her advisory board. And I know the company inside out. And let me tell you, the level of talent is incredible. The level of professionalism is incredible. And above all, is the commanders and the founders' spirit. Today, APCO Worldwide is present in tens of countries. They're handling issues from government relations to business diplomacy for over 500 clients. Many of their clients are household names, big brands. And we're so honored and privileged to have her here tonight. So Margery, I'm so thankful for you being here tonight. And she's joined by one of the executives of APCO Worldwide in New York, Mr. Elliot Hoff, who's here. So without further ado, Margery will speak, and then we'll take questions from the audience, and then we'll just enjoy the rest of the evening. Margery, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Ido. I came because I do everything Ido asked me to do, like all of us, right? So this is, I'll put down my aid. I'm really not old and feeble. Well, I might be old, but this is due to an accident on a snowmobile in Iceland. So you might want to consider the mental state of the person who's talking to you. But I have 9 grandchildren, and when they turn 10, they research someplace in the world they really want to go. And they present their thesis to their grandparents, and if they pass the thesis, we take them. And they help to plan the itinerary, would convince people she'd pull people off the boats and say they were cousins or they were friends or something, and she'd raise money and be able to, I don't know what she did, bribe people or whatever. And so we kind of grew up with parents who, really cared about people and cared about the world, and it was very much a part of our value system growing up. I grew up about an hour from here, but it may as well be a century from here, in a very small town in northern New Jersey called Franklin, where there were 3,000 people. My school was K through 12 in one building, and I never graduated high school. Because by the time I was a senior, or to be a senior, I had done a lot of things like being an au pair in Austria and doing a variety of other things, and I had taken all the courses I could take, but I didn't have 4 years of physical education, and you don't get a diploma in New Jersey unless you have 4 years of PE and 4 years of English. So I convinced 3 colleges. I had to deal with my parents if I applied to 3 schools and got in that they wouldn't stand in my way, so off I went. And so I went to school in Illinois, and then I finished in Washington. I finished in Washington because I got infatuated with political science, and at that time, this is in the 60s, so it was an interesting time to be a political scientist, but also as a woman, you had a choice, nursing or teaching, right? So I became a civics teacher in Northern Virginia, where I still live. And so the pathway from being a civics teacher to what I'm doing today is really maybe a story about America, but it's also a story about never taking no for an answer and being passionate about what you do and seeing a world that's a little bit bigger maybe than others see. And so when I left, I started something called the Close-Up Foundation, which some of you may know. It's now almost 50 years old. It's brought 1 million young people to Washington to learn how to find their voice. And so it's a program that uses Washington as a classroom. So for me, as a teacher and a political scientist, and knowing that textbooks never tell the story, this idea of first-hand learning experience was something that I was extremely passionate about. And so I helped build this foundation. And in 1984, as part of my work for Close-Up, in the 70s I helped C-SPAN when it got started, and so we would take the program to more schools. And then in the mid-80s, when there was the bicentennial of the Constitution, there was a commission. And Arnold and Porter was the legal counsel to the commission, and they were helping cities get their cable franchises, and they were fascinated by what we had done with the downtime on cable, and asked if I would set up a business plan so that, and I thought Close-Up would benefit from this, but a long story short, Close-Up didn't do it. Arnold and Porter was very interested in the partners there. There was a group of partners that did more project development than practicing law. So they somehow fixated on setting up a consulting affiliate and wanted me to run it. Me, the non-lawyer school teacher, going to a law firm like that was quite, I said no a lot, and then finally I started to think that maybe what I had learned in building this not-for-profit organization would teach me some things that maybe I could apply in a different way. So in February 1984, I went to Arnold and Porter. I left a staff of 200 people in a corner office to go borrow furniture as a non-lawyer from the partner pool of furniture with a permission slip, to having a half a secretary and a small office. But when I got there, I discovered there really was no business plan and there were no clients. And at this point, I was already 38 years old and not not used to failure. So I thought, well, I'm here. And so I started to think about maybe what services might be interesting and might be needed. And Arnold and Porter did a lot of work globally. They did a lot of trade work, and it really was an exposure to a little bit different world. But what I found was they were really, really smart, but sometimes the EQ part of it wasn't there. Why do people, and I know there are a couple of people in the audience who were telling me that they think about what makes people do things, the behavioral side, not the intellectual side maybe. And so that's an area that I always felt very comfortable in, not only as a teacher, but political socialization was one of my fields when I was studying. So I started to look at what they were doing, and I also from close-up knew about half the Congress because we used Congress as a classroom. And thought there's a missing link out there. There's something that, when we're looking at the relationships between business and society and business and government, and as people are trying to solve problems through public-private partnerships, there's a missing link. So I thought, why not? I mean, to me, this was just common sense and problem solving and creating opportunities by bringing together some thinking that was not limited to what lane you were in, but really thinking more broadly. And everybody was shocked that it was like fresh air and nobody else was doing it quite that way. And it just caught on. So I was the first and only employee in February of 1984. And today APCO has about 800 employees in 25 countries, 32 offices, all built from scratch. We went into these countries, we found out, thank you. It's only taken me 35 years, okay, so, but who's counting when you're having fun? But there are some really interesting things along the way that maybe relate to the conference, and I can't stress this enough. I think what happened was there was a gap, and this gap is really an understanding gap in a lot of ways about how do we communicate with each other and how do we look across the table, whether we're in, God knows today in this world, we really need this. But how do you make things a win-win situation? And how do you kind of think about how to frame and position what you're doing so that the other person understands the benefit of it? And I think that if you were in government has depended for many years on their ambassador corps and their embassies to know what's going on the ground in other countries, to have these back channels of communication, and to try to take things forward. But nothing like that existed for business. And nothing like that really existed for NGOs. And so my thought was, if we could replicate kind of the range of services that embassies did for their governments, we could be able to do that for other people. It would be more accessible. So part of what we have done over the years is to basically be a bridge. And the kind of services we offer are the full range of services to business and to other organizations that an embassy would offer to its government. So there's communications function, there's economic development, there's understanding constituencies, there's pulling people together, there's dealing with the media, there's dealing with other parts of government, there's all kinds of things. And what we've done is created an organization where people come from all these different professions so that we can work in teams and people bring their relative perspectives to the table so that our clients have the benefit of this kind of different way of thinking. And I call it actually because when we went into these markets, we tried to find people who were like-minded, who were local experts but were globalists and thought beyond their local markets, and who also were willing to learn new things and willing to work in a very integrated way, whether they were, whether they were from the media side or the business side or whatever. And so it made for a very rich environment and really very creative solutions to problems. And it was that was the results that really propelled the company forward. I mean, I'd like to take a lot of credit. Maybe my credit was finding good people, but it's the people who make this work. And so why is this so important right now? It's important because I think in the world that we see today, governments are floundering. There are fewer resources. There's less leadership. Some of the, we just have to just look around, right? And so what's happened on the business side or on the NGO side? So this idea of creative partnerships that are a mix between business, government, and the third-party sectors, including NGOs, are really how we're going to solve the bigger problems today. They're bigger than government. They're bigger than business. We need to be working together. And in a lot of places, what happens is that that the expectations of constituencies in these countries, starting in the United States, are much more focused on what can business offer, because many of the businesses actually know how to get things done in some of these places where even government doesn't know all the solutions. And so there's a rising expectation that business will come forward with some creative solutions and will work in partnership to get things done. And that's why we hear so much today about purpose-driven companies. What can you do for society? How do we renegotiate the social compact between business and society in a way that enables these businesses to show what they're going to do beyond profits? And obviously business needs to make a profit or they're not sustainable. But what are they doing to contribute back to society? And I don't mean just money, but with their know-how and their abilities and their relationships. And so a lot of what we have been doing is helping companies as they kind of strive to find this purpose. And then for the companies themselves, being able to operate in a way that they can show what they can contribute back to society is really an important thing. And so, we do all the normal things a company like ours does, every day, but these are the special things that we've been doing and trying to help people learn how to do so that we can make the world a little smarter and better, for all of us. And so that's kind of, maybe the lessons learned from this. For me, as a woman growing up when I did, and as somebody who had to kind of put things together when everybody said it was impossible, was my mother told me from the time I was little that where there was a will, there was a way. And maybe just being inherently stubborn was one of the things that kind of got me. But I think the other part of it is, and this is for the students in the room, really never underestimate the power of being underestimated. And that was probably the best lesson of all. So I'm trying to keep this short. So I'd love to take questions. I could talk about this for a very long time. I'm trying to be disciplined. But I hope that was enough to maybe stimulate some questions from you. Sorry?
Were you yourself born in Cuba?
I was not born in Cuba. I was born in Franklin, New Jersey, but my mother was born in Poland, but her sisters and brothers were born in Cuba. And they came, my mother came to the United States when she got married, but my uncles came when Castro came to Cuba. And we, one by one they came.
She was there with the St. Louis?
Yes, she was there when the St. Louis came. She lived there until 1942, something like that.
What was her maiden name?
Her maiden name was Svern, C-V-E-R-N, Svern. Now, was that the real maiden name? I guess so. When people came, like my father's name was, my grandfather used to say his name was Rosenwasser, and he left the Wasser in the ocean because my maiden name is Rosen. But it turned out to be true. I went to Poland to trace all this, and he was Rosenwasser. And I thought, Grandpa, I wish I knew, But, so it's Fern. It was Cafe Lily, if you know people from there. Cafe Lily. My mother was Lily. Oh, you were there. Well.
Adita had a question.
Yes.
I
I'm just soaking it all in. Incredible. So the metrics, how much of APCO's work is governmental? How much of it is business? How much, and can you give me a number, like you span how many countries in your history? And then one last thing, do you have the most interesting story to tell about some particular client?
Yeah, but then you'll have to kill me, I have a lot of stories to tell. So we're in about 25 countries. I'd have to count because like in Germany and China and a lot of places we have 2 in a market. So, and then we have 5 in the US. So I think it's around 25 countries. Our second office, this is as crazy as going snowmobiling when you're 72 years old, but our second office was Moscow in 1988. Walking in and starting something from scratch there at that time, and we've had continuous presence there. So a lot of the stories would come from the 90s in Moscow, but you can imagine our most famous client probably during that time was Michel Khodorkovsky and the whole Yukos case. So there's a lot of things behind the scenes to talk about. But the metrics of who we work for, about 60% is business, and the rest is divided between, we represent some countries, and we're doing some work for those countries on economic development and some changes that are going on. And then we also work for some of the larger NGOs. So it's a real mix of people, just like our staff is a mix of people. And then lots of interesting things. Things you would never expect, like last year, we ended up running America's presence at Expo, this is 2017, in Astana, Kazakhstan. And the path to that was that we had done work in Kazakhstan for about 18 years. The US, by law, cannot use public money for these expos. The government, the business sector, like the companies that were very big there, like GE and Citibank and Chevron, really were embarrassed by the lack of US presence. So the ambassador called us in because they trust us and said, can you get this organized? Because the State Department is right between the transition between Obama and Trump, and nobody would make decisions. So we came in and we raised the money, and we never had built a pavilion before, but we got some experts in and we did it. And then we got American students who spoke Russian to be the staff, and these students had a wonderful experience for the summer. We trained them, and they left a legacy of great friendships in the path. And it was one of the most visited, besides the Kazakh pavilion, which cost a lot more than our pavilion. It was probably one of the most visited pavilions on the ground. So it's just a matter of, there's no rhyme or reason to some of these things except being in harm's way and figuring out how to do something. And so that was maybe a good example of bringing everyone together. Yeah. Want another couple questions?
Yeah, maybe
And then-
we have one last question.
Yes,
One-
within the model that you've created, the business of diplomacy, is there a new kind of challenge going forward that you're dealing with?
Is there a new kind of challenge because of business diplomacy? I don't know that business diplomacy is causing the challenge, but it's a new challenge to address it. As I said, I think that a lot of these countries are looking for business to contribute more to society, and how they do that, whether they are helping with regulations or whether they are, one of the best examples of this that I had in thinking back is I was asked to do a project at one point in Costa Rica for a big US company. And when I went down there, this is kind of an aha moment for me. They were showing me that they had bought this plant and what they did. And the way they were treating the wastewater from the plant was far in excess of any of the regulations in that country, way beyond it, because they had a rule in their multinational company that they would use best practices wherever they went. And so they brought to these countries some new technologies and new ways of treating wastewater that would never have happened if they didn't buy that company. And so I realized that, you know, for all the sins maybe of bigger companies over time, there's so much that they bring to these countries that they wouldn't have themselves, and that the governments had no incentive to really increase the rules because they would have had a lot of opposition locally. And so I think that's the kind of thing that these companies, you know, kind of problems that they can solve.
To allow people to...
Yeah. Okay, thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Margery, for this incredible presentation. And I just wanted to say a few more things before we close the program. APCO has an office in Tel Aviv. And one of the things that I'm trying to do with APCO is to work on place branding. And we are very, very honored, you know, that Israel as a brand has many assets, but not all of Israel's assets are actually conducive to the brand. For example, military. We have an excellent military, but it doesn't help us to bring more investment. It doesn't help us to bring more tourists. It doesn't help us to improve Israel's image, definitely. So it's a great asset, but it's not an asset for the brand. The number one asset for the brand is undoubtedly the city of Tel Aviv. And we are blessed to have with us the woman. We are now about women tonight. We are happy to have with us here tonight the woman who not only built the brand for Tel Aviv, but actually executed the plan brilliantly for the past 10 years and is now the head of the Tel Aviv Foundation, Ido Aharoni. Stand up, please, and be recognized. Hila really, she did the impossible with very little budget, with very little human resources. She single-handedly branded Tel Aviv as one of the most exciting places in the world, and I'm sure you will all agree with me. And if you've not been to Tel Aviv, talk to Hila. She'll take care of it. And she's joined by the head of our office in North America, Yehuda Gidron, and her assistant, Leo Shachar from Israel. Thank you again, Margery. I just wanted to, before we close the reception and let you mingle, and Margery will be available for more in-person conversations with you, I just wanted to tell you a little story about faith, about connection to a place, and because the story involves a very dear friend of mine who's here in the room. So back in, I served in New York from 2001 to 2005, and I think about a year into my first term, a filmmaker came to see me, not Jewish. He mentioned he was married to a Jewish woman, but was not Jewish, and he said, I want to go and make a movie about the next great Palestinian leader. And I told him, as much as I love to find the great next Palestinian leader, I think that the real story is elsewhere. Just go to Israel, have a great time, and find the story. And he did. He went to Israel, he raised some money, and he went to Tel Aviv, Hila's city. And he, just one night, went to have a drink in this place called Mike's Place in Tel Aviv, which is right under the American Embassy.
Old American Embassy.
The old American Embassy, but it's still the same building. And he was astonished how cosmopolitan this little pub was. You had people from Australia, from Scotland, from New Zealand, from the United States, from England, from all over the world. The musicians, they fell in love with the bartender, he fell in love with the musicians, he fell in love with the waitress, he fell in love with the whole thing, came back, and he said, I found my movie. I'm going to make a movie about this incredible pub in Tel Aviv. And he did. He raised the money, went back, and started to shoot the movie. And one night, as they were just folding all their equipment, in April of 2003, just as he was about to leave the pub, he saw two young, good-looking men, but strangely wearing coats, winter coats, standing outside, waiting to walk in. And he thought it was bizarre, but didn't really think too much about it because they didn't have time. One of them, both of them carried suicide bombing vests, and one of them exploded and nearly killed our friend Jack Baxter, who's here tonight. Jack, where are you? This is Jack Baxter, filmmaker. And Jack was 8 days in coma, and he made a very brave decision after he got out of the hospital to continue with the making of the movie. And the movie was released a couple of years later. It's called Blues by the Beach. But why am I telling you this story? Because rather than becoming a bitter man and a pessimistic man, what this tragedy did to Jack turned him into a great believer in the human spirit, which he always was, but even more forcefully. And now, many years after this traumatic experience, and he still suffers from it physically, he decided to produce yet another movie to close the circle, trying to communicate with the relatives of those who tried to kill him, tracing the story, the journey of Islam in Europe. And he did the incredible. He created an amazing movie called The Last Sermon that was just finished the post-production. It's about to be released. And I urge all of you to approach Jack and his beautiful wife, Fran, who's here, and to learn more about his personal story, which was also told in an amazing book called also Blues by the Beach. So this is a story about a connection of a place. He will be forever connected to Israel, forever connected to Tel Aviv, forever connected to Mike's Place, and always will be our friend, Jack Baxter. Thank you so much for everything you stand for. And on this happy note, I'd like to thank you all for being here, and I hope to see you tomorrow. We have a very, very exciting program. Enjoy the rest of the evening.